think most leaders don't know that they're leaders until they are. The really good ones. Because to be a leader, you need to be recognized by your community as being someone who can help them. And so to become an effective leader, you have to be a part of that community. What does the community need? And of course, what is that community? And that doesn't make a difference whether it is a business, a faith community, a country, or even a people.
القيادة هي قدرة الشخص على التأثير اجتماعياً على الفريق المتواجد معه، وبالتالي تعتبر في هذا السياق هي المحفز الأساسي لفريق العمل من حيث تقسيم المهارات وتقسيم أيضاً المهام الموجودة للفريق من أجل الحصول على أفضل النتائج الممكنة.
A great leadership team is therefore diverse. It represents people of different abilities, different backgrounds, different experiences, different levels of education. All the different ways in which you are part of a community should be represented in your leadership team in some way, so that the people who are being led and who have to work with you to realize the full potential of a community recognize themselves in that leadership team.
يعتبر القائد بشكل أساسي هو ذلك الشخص الذي يمتلك القدرات والمهارات التي تبنى على الإبداع وعلى الابتكار، التي تمهد أيضاً لقيادة الفريق وقيادة المؤسسات بشكل جداً فعال.
All people have it in themselves to be able to be leaders. And to be a future leader, you can also cultivate those qualities in yourself. And one of the most important ones is self-awareness, reflection on your own condition, checking in with yourself, and really figuring out whether some possibility or opportunity is the right one for you, and then mobilizing the resources to follow that opportunity.
قصة قيام دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة من أعظم القصص القيادية التي قامت على تغيير الواقع من عوامل سلبية إلى عوامل إيجابية ساعدت على تأسيس دولة الإمارات. إن أبرز ما يمثل التجربة الفريدة لقيادة الشيخ زايد رحمه الله هو اعتماده على الشخصية الكاريزمية التي جعلت لقراراته وقناعاته القبول في عقول وقلوب مواطنيه.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الفريق اسمه الشيخ سيف بن زايد النهيان، نائب رئيس مجلس الوزراء وزير الداخلية. سمو الشيوخ، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، الضيوف الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اسمحوا لي بداية بالتعريف عن نفسي. خالد مايد رميثي، مدير تطوير استراتيجية التعليم في ديوان الرئاسة. إنه لشرف لي اليوم أن أتولى مهمة إدارة الحوار في هذا المجلس الذي نقش رؤى ونشر دروساً وقصص نجاحات، واستفاض علماً اقتداءً باسم بانيه صاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن زايد النهيان. هذا المجلس الذي جمع العقول وقدم الحلول، وها هنا اليوم نحن نجتمع فيه ونرحب بضيف جديد لهذا المجلس الكريم. من أقوال سيدي صاحب السمو رئيس الدولة حفظه الله: سر نجاح أداء أي مؤسسة هو العمل بروح الفريق الواحد والانسجام بين أعضائه. الحضور الكريم، نرحب اليوم بالسيد ستيف كوكرم الذي شارك في تأليف عدة كتب، منها كتاب The 100X Leader وكتاب 5 Gears، وأحد مؤسسي شركة جاينت، شركة عالمية متخصصة في القيادة والتدريب، ومتخصص في تمكين القادة وفنون إدارة الفرق وتحسين المهارات القيادية. لدى السيد ستيف كوكرم اهتمام كبير في تحسين منظومة عمل المؤسسات من خلال تمكين القادة التنفيذيين وتصميم أطر التواصل ما بين فرق العمل، وترسيخ وتفعيل مفهوم التوازن بين العمل والحياة. تمكن السيد ستيف كوكرم من خلال خبراته السابقة في منظومة التطوير القيادي من تطوير الخصال القيادية للعديد من القادة التنفيذيين حول العالم. محاضرتنا لليوم بعنوان إتقان القيادة والنجاح في عالمنا المعاصر. ونلفت عنايتكم إلى أن هذه المحاضرة ستكون باللغة الإنجليزية، وبإمكانكم استخدام السماعات لمتابعة الترجمة الفورية. واسمحوا لي الآن بأن أكمل حديثي باللغة الإنجليزية. Your Highnesses, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome today yet another special guest speaker, a co-author of one of the most influential books, such as The 100X Leader and 5 Gears, and the co-founder of Giant, a global company specializing in leader transformation, Mr. Steve Cockram. He has taken into consideration the aim of unlocking the leadership potential in people by developing capacities in organizational leadership and emotional intelligence, and building better organizational cultures.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation to be with you today. Thank you for the warmth of your hospitality. Thank you to all those who've taken time in the last few days to meet with Becky and I. So what the challenge for every speaker is to try and find a title that people might be interested in. And the question of what does it mean to lead and also to win in the world that we find ourselves in today is what I'd like to share a little bit with you over the next few minutes. And it's always encouraging when I'm talking to leaders that I really want to win. I love the dream of what you wish the Emirati states to be, and for anything that I'm able to share today that helps that would be a privilege. Now, by way of introduction, this journey began 10 years ago, almost to the day where my business partner and I, an American, moved his family over to the UK, and we spent a year together living in this big country estate. We had the East Wing, they had the West Wing, and we dreamed of what we'd most love to do with the next 20 years of our work, and we based it on a premise that proved to be true. We both loved history, and we kind of felt that we were in the middle of a massive cultural upheaval that happened roughly every 100, 200 years in sort of Western history, where there is a technological breakthrough that changes the world of work. And when the world of work changes, the skills of leadership invariably have to change with it. And being a bit of a historian, so you can see some pictures as well, they don't look like incredible technological breakthroughs to us today, but I promise you the printing press was an amazing moment in human evolution that led to the information age and the ability to read books in your own language, the things we take for granted today. We have James Barr and the rotary steam engine that, believe it or not, had 10 horsepower. But it led to a transformation of working practices as we moved from kind of towns to be able to be in bigger cities and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And a gentleman called Tim Berners-Lee, who probably doesn't receive the recognition and the credit he should, and probably not the economic return either. In 1989, Tim Berners-Lee typed 3 letters and a dot and changed the trajectory of the world in which you and I are now called to lead. And we're at the very beginning, really, of what they're calling the digital age. Whenever there has been one of these moments in history in the past, there is almost always a dilemma that leaders face. Because on one hand, there is an entrepreneurial opportunity, because no one's been to this place before. And you watch in every moment in history, people who see the opportunity, who are not threatened and frightened by the fear of change, embrace the opportunity that the new technology brings. But on the other end of the continuum, there are those who are fearful of change. They're frightened of what it means for them, and they have a tendency to be fearful of it. And for you historians in the audience, you'll know that when the original books were printed, which led really, I guess, to the Reformation in Western Europe, many of those books were burnt, and so were those who wrote the first ones. And for those of you who remember your Industrial Revolution as you learnt it, there were many who were so threatened by the technological advance, they broke in and tried to destroy the factories. The Luddites, I think they were called. History will also tell you, though, that when a technological breakthrough happens, It cannot be disinvented. And so therefore we sit at the moment in history where there is an incredible entrepreneurial opportunity for those individuals, companies, organizations, nations that grasp the new opportunity. Don't lose the things from their past that are important, but embrace that change. And I see that and that desire in so many of the things that I read about your country. Because the question often asked is, which organizations, which nations are not just going to survive this technological revolution? Which are the ones that are going to thrive? Which are the ones that are going to win? Which are the ones that are going to embrace the opportunity, even with a little bit of fear and intrepidation, but who are going to grasp the opportunity to shape the new world and to effectively lead it? And what I wanted to do for you this afternoon was to share, hopefully, in an amusing visual way, the 3 challenges that I know every single one of you will have to deal with as we seek to lead into the world which is and is coming. One for you as individuals, which I hope will be helpful. One for those of you who lead people and teams. And perhaps also a final one for those of you who lead organizations and even nations. So the first one is this, and it's slightly more personal than most people realize. How do I, as a leader, stay emotionally, physically, intellectually healthy for the long term in a world now where work never stops? You remember in the industrial age, we used to go to work, we'd often punch in, we punched out. There were clear delineated boundaries between when we were at work and when we were at rest, when we were at play. Some of you may remember those first mobile phones. I had a briefcase. I thought I was particularly fashionable and cool, and we used to take it on holiday with us, but usually it just didn't work. But the reality is, in the world we live in today, the digital world never switches off. And you'll find that people by the side of swimming pools on vacations and holidays will still have laptops, they'll still have their iPhones or whatever it is they have with them. And one of the challenges that every leader has to face is, how do I maintain a level of health and performance over time? Because we are dealing with an epidemic in so many ways of ill health in our workplaces. People are mentally, physically exhausted. Well-being, which was never really a topic of conversation in the industrial age, is now front and center with many of the companies we work with. And tragically, the happiness index, how you track this, I've no idea, but apparently the happiness index of the world is diminishing at a time when they said the technological revolution should actually help us to be happier and healthier. And I love that part of your vision of the centennial future is linked to happiness, wholeness, family, all the things I think that we're tempted to lose when we get overwhelmed by the constant demand and treadmill of work. If we don't put in place rhythms and patterns, they won't happen. And we found the new world, by the way, everyone was so bombarded with information that no matter how interesting the conversation or how good the talk or how profound the book, if we couldn't capture the learning in a simple tool that an educated 13-year-old could understand, use, and teach to their friends, in the end, the moment they walked out of the lecture theatre and get bombarded with all the demands of the modern digital working life, it disappeared. So 5 Gears is a practical tool I offer to you and hope you can use. Now, most of you now have an automatic car. If you're lucky enough to have a Ferrari, you actually still have real gears. And if you imagine in a car, all the gears are useful. All the gears are healthy. You may love first gear in your car, but I promise you, if you're driving at 50 miles an hour, no one in the car is going to be that excited about your love of first gear. So think about your working life for a moment. 5th gear is what we call focus mode. You're in the zone, maximum productivity, 0 interruptions. It's 3 o'clock and you look and go, wow, I've got so much done today and I've had no interruptions. Some of you love 5th gear. Some of you would live in 5th gear all the time if you possibly could. So think of 5th gear. Ask yourself this question. How much do I enjoy it? Do I really like 5th gear? 4th gear is what we call task mode. It's still work. It's still productivity. but it's more multitasking, spinning plates, meetings, calls, emails, writing, whatever it might be. It's more reactive than fifth gear, and it's probably where most of us spend a lot of our working day. And fourth gear, you can work hard all day, you get to the end of the day and you go, wow, I've worked hard all day, but I don't think I've really checked a lot off my list. I've tended to be reacting to what people put in front of me. So that's fourth gear. And then third gear is what we call social mode. And third gear is not a working gear. Third gear is the polite conversation you're probably going to have after this particular lecture. It's when you're meeting with friends in a social environment. It's not complete depth, but it's learning how to be appropriately socially present. We talk about learning to be interested rather than always trying to be interesting. Asking good questions, finding out about the people you're engaging with. And when somebody asks you in third gear, Steve, how are you? The answer is not a deep, penetrating insight into kind of the struggles of my depression and life. It's, I'm doing fine, how are you? But in second gear is what we call connect mode. There is no work in second gear. It's where we're actually intentionally being present with those we love most to be truly physically, intellectually, emotionally in that moment with them, where we're connecting for real. And if somebody says, Steve, how are you in second gear? I may take a deep breath and go, gosh, honestly, I'm pretty worn out. Work's a struggle at the moment. I've got elderly parents I'm looking after. My teenage daughter is a challenge. Thanks for asking. Do you see the difference between third gear, which is polite social mode, and second gear, which is more of that relational connect? And then first gear, probably the most important gear in the gearbox, the ability to recharge, to unplug, to take time to truly recreate and replenish our own batteries. Now, in the old days, as I said, in the industrial world, the world kind of put the barriers in place for us. We knew when we were at work, we knew when we were at home, we knew when we were on vacation. The modern world, if we're careful, becomes a treadmill that we never seem to get off. And lastly, of course, reverse, which is helpful, the ability to say sorry and apologize. Now, I wonder if you think of those gears for you, which ones you are best at, which ones you enjoy most, and which ones you find difficult. I always say that I love fourth and third gear. I love work, I love winning, I love meeting new people, I love finding out about cultures. I'm good at doing number one because I love to find a way to unplug and recharge. The two I struggle most with are fifth gear and second gear. I don't really like being on my own, in the zone, having to get things done. That usually happens when I've got a tax return deadline or I'm up against a deadline for a particular book or whatever it might be. And then the one I struggle most with, and this is my confession because as someone who teaches on emotional intelligence and relational connectivity, to confess to you, the hardest gear for me is connect mode. I find myself having to be very intentional to be truly present, even with the people I love most. I've taught this to my family, and I promise you, even a couple of weeks ago, we were watching a family movie together, as we often do, and in a moment of weakness, I turned to Helen and said, I really must book the flights before we go to wherever it was. And the three children turned around and looked at me and goes, Dad, we're in second gear. You're in the wrong gear. You're in fourth, and you're going to miss this opportunity. Do you see how powerful it is when the children you teach can actually use your own tools on you? So here's two things I want you to remember. If you do not have a first gear strategy, it's very, very unlikely that you will be able to perform long term at the level of leadership and influence that you are most capable of. You have to learn how to recharge. You have to create space where you do the things that recreate you. And the second thing is this: you can't outsource the gears you find most difficult. It's really annoying, I've tried. I actually have to schedule time for the gears that I find most difficult. So I have time in my calendar called fifth gear, where I'm in the zone, I turn off my phone, I turn off social media because I can get things done. And you will find, if you look in my calendar, the big thing is there is second gear time. There are times when I try and be truly present and I put my phone away. I have an addiction to mobile phone. I don't know whether any of you have that as well. I find I start to sweat if it's not near me, and that's probably an indication that I struggle to do those second gears. So that's the first one for leaders. It's not necessarily the one you thought I was going to share with you, but if you learn how to do first gear well and teach the people you lead to do it, you will be able to lead for the long term, because the world we live in today will just keep going. If you don't do first gear, you'll struggle. So there's number one. And the second challenge, which we're going to spend more time on than the others, because I think it's the most profound for you, the audience here, is how do I learn to lead through influence more than positional power or title? Now, in the industrial world, you kind of did your time. You worked your way up through the ranks, and eventually, when you got maybe to 45, 50, you reached the point where you became the director. You were the one who was able to decide what the strategy was. But up until that point, you pretty much did what you were told. The reality is, we are at a place in history where the hierarchical structures are being squashed, and what we're really dealing with is the fact there is a new generation already in our workforce who were born after 1989 who do not think and act like those of us born before that time. Now, I'm not going to ask who was born after 1989 because that might be slightly embarrassing. But for those of you who were, here's the thing you need to understand. You are at a huge advantage in the digital world. I don't know how many of you read Harry Potter, but you are purebloods in the digital world. You are a native. You've never known life without connectivity, without iPhones, without computers, without the internet. Those of us who were born before 1989, at best we are mudbloods to the new world because it's not native to us. Or there will be a temptation for some of us to be muggles and try and pretend that the digital revolution never happened and that there is no such thing as a magical digital world. So learning to lead through influence is a huge challenge, particularly for those of us of a certain age that at this point really should be the masters and the mistresses of all we survey. Some of you will be like me and slightly miffed that we happen to be born at the wrong time in history when actually there are people who are far younger than me who are more talented than I am at actually facing the challenges that the digital world pose. Because the reality is this, the world in which we are living, the world in which our children will grow up in, is far too complex now for any one person to have all the answers. The ability to build high-performing teams, to harness the superpowers of all of the people, the diversity that was referenced in the introductory video, different ages, different genders, ethnicities, belief systems, ways of viewing the world, different personalities. Leaders are going to have to deal with what we call their own wall of self-preservation, because I and you do not have all the answers. And over the last 10 years, as we've worked with some of the, from the largest companies in the world like Google and Amazon, whatever it be, all the way down to small educational facilities, we've constantly benchmarked the performance of teams at the beginning of the engagement. And the reality is the average team in this system scored 59%. And that's the main reason being is that in the average team, in the average organization on the average day, 82% of people do not feel truly heard, valued, and appreciated. Now I know 74.6% of statistics are made up on the spot, but that's a real statistic that comes out of the Five Voices book. And that explains why so many teams do not perform at the level they could, because they don't hear the wisdom and the insights of everyone that is in them. And that challenge, which is relational intelligence, is probably now more important than IQ. None of us are ever going to know more than Google. And if we thought we were, ChatGPT is probably going to answer those questions for us as well. The ability to lead people and to harness the superpowers of those you lead is the skill set of leadership in the new world. Because though those young people may be slightly annoying and asking you questions and expecting access to you in a way I never expected access to the CEO when I was growing up, what they're actually going to do is they're looking for mentors. They're looking for people who will invest in them. And so Remember I said visual tools are so much easier to remember than words. Every leader who was born before 1989 is at some point going to deal with the fact they don't feel totally secure leading in this new world. They're going to realize that some of the skill sets that they learn are no longer the skill sets of leadership for the world we live in today. And they're going to look at the young people and go, I don't really understand why you lead or why you behave the way you do. And it happens to me often because I go, I'd like to be the fount of all knowledge. That's probably my default. And I like to think that I'm the main person in any room. The biggest learning for me has been the most talented people in my team are usually not me. But here's the thing, when you will demonstrate that level of humility, when you have the ability to go, I'm not going to let my wall of self-preservation come up. I'm going to feel that fear. I'm going to embrace it, and I'm going to say, I'm not going to choose to go there. I always ask myself 3 questions when I feel insecure, when I wonder whether people think I'm good enough to do what I do. I go, what am I afraid of losing? What am I trying to hide? Or what am I trying to prove and to whom? And I know that whether you admit it or not, every single person here, there will be moments when we go, I don't understand this new world. I don't understand why leadership is so much more complicated than it used to be. And you'll be tempted to retreat back into what you know. But the reality is this, the technological revolution will never be reversed. We either have to learn to embrace the challenge and grow with that challenge and grow the skill sets that the new world will demand, or we will become like an oxbow lake. Doesn't matter how important you are right now, these are some of the issues that all of us will have to deal with, rather than the river running by and effectively leaving us as a relic of the past. Now I'm going to tell you a story now because you've done incredibly well, and it's hard to sit and listen at this time of the day, I know. I don't know if anyone recognizes what that mountain is. It is Mount Everest. This was part of the inspiration behind the 100X Leader book. To ask the question is, what type of leadership does the new world lead? And for any of you who understand Everest, climbing Everest is an incredible physical feat. It takes years of training. It takes years of preparation. And to stand on the top of the world and hold your hands up in the blue sky is something that very, very few people do. And we can celebrate elite climbers like this man here. But the thing that really struck Jeremy and I as we studied this was that behind every person with a photograph like that was somebody on their right called a Sherpa. Nobody will climb Mount Everest without the help of a skilled guide. Sherpas are an indigenous people group. They were born at altitude. They literally have this incredible capacity to help people climb. They carry the packs, they lay the ropes, they move the ladders every day because the ice floes move. Behind every elite performer is always somebody who's chosen to measure their value not in what they achieved, but in how many people they enabled to do something beyond what they would ever believe was possible. And if you talk to Sherpas, we interviewed one for our podcast, they're some of the most humble leaders I've ever come across. I'll ask them, how many times have you climbed Everest? And they don't know. But if you ask them, how many people have you helped to summit Mount Everest? Every single one of them knows the number. So what you're looking at is a type of leadership which is actually very different from a lot of the leadership which we saw in the past. The leadership that has the ability to calibrate high support and high challenge for those that you are responsible for. That is what we call a liberating leader or a Sherpa. And they create the most incredibly empowering cultures where the people they lead have the opportunity to do things that often they themselves do not believe is possible. But notice that challenge is as much as support in that process. Sherpas can be incredibly fierce. If they don't believe that you are safe to climb the mountain or you're going to put others' lives or your own life at risk, they will literally say no. It doesn't matter what you've paid to go up Mount Everest. The Sherpa in the end has a duty of care and responsibility to ensure that you have the best opportunity to get where you're going. So if you remember one tool, if you take one thing into the future, whether it's with your children, whether it's with your team, whether it's with the organization, the ability to think through, how do I calibrate high support and high challenge for those I lead? And you know, it is not as easy as it sounds. Most people think, well, I'll just do for you what I would like done for me. And you will get it wrong about 92% of the time. Part of leadership is learning to understand the people that you lead, what makes them tick, how they're wired, what it is that they're passionate about. And I always say to anyone, if you are willing to take the liberating challenge, here is a tool that you can put in your tool belt that I've used every day or every week for 9 years. And it says, at the start of the week, I think of all the people I lead and all the people I'm responsible for. And I look first in the mirror and I say, Steve, are you prepared to fight to be a liberating influence in their life again? If the answer is yes, then what I do now is I start to look not in the mirror, but I look out as a lens. And I think of each individual and I ask these 3 questions. What calibration of support or challenge do they need from me right now? Are they struggling? Are they getting complacent? What's the challenge support? And it changes every week. That's why tools are so much better than kind of a library at this stage of your life, because you need tools because the terrain changes as you lead. Second question, and this is one that we Brits struggle most with. What are the tendencies or patterns of behavior most undermining their influence? I don't know so much about you guys, but in Britain we specialize in passive aggression. We we know something's wrong with an individual, but we never tell them until they die, and then we say nice things at their funeral. And part of being a liberating leader in people's lives is choosing to fight for their highest possible good, even if it's a challenge for you, to say, how do you think you showed up in that meeting yesterday? Are you aware of how you came across to those present? You're always late. You always are too opinionated. You never bring your opinion forward. Whatever it might be, the liberating leader or the Sherpa is always fighting for the highest possible good. And every person I lead, they know exactly what we're working on because we work on one at a time. If somebody rolled out a list and said, Steve, here's 48 tendencies that are undermining your influence, it would be crushing. It's too heavy to bear. But to have one thing at a time and to know that I've got a leader who's willing to work with me on that is huge. And then how do I help them get to the next level? How do I know enough about each person I lead to know what they have hope and dream for their life? In the digital world, it's unlikely they're going to work for you for 40 years, retire with the carriage clock and the pension. Most of them will stay for a few years. But in the world we live in today, your reputation and your influence goes with them, because in the digital world, what they leave on glass doors and what they leave on social media and what they say about you is the biggest brand ambassador as many ways for what you do. So there's a second one for you, and a little challenge. When you look in the mirror right now, all the tools are mirrors. How good are you as a Sherpa? So the first question is, how good are you at doing your job? How good are you as a climber? The things you usually get paid for and valued for. Stand on the mountain, put your hands up. How good are you at doing what you do? We're all called to be excellent at what we do. It's part of the challenge of growth. But interestingly, how good are we at leading others? How good are we at creating the environments where others thrive around us? The industrial world would have happily taken a 10-2. The digital world and the world we live in today, probably someone who is a 7-8 is more valuable to the organization, because if you're someone who's able to develop and grow leadership around you, you will leave a generational legacy. I often say, if you want a real challenge, for those of you who are already doing this and good at it, I ask myself, 100x to the power what in my lifetime? If I was able to create generational change and the people I invested in multiplied that life into someone else, who multiplied that life into someone else, and I did it 6 times, 100x to the power 6, then I believe what we leave then is not just a great memories, we begin to leave a legacy that changes history. So here's my last point for you. Remember I said as well that there's a challenge for you as an individual, your first gear, and there's a challenge for those of us who lead people and lead teams. How do we do that well? But some of you lead organizations. Some of you even lead nations. And when people always ask, Steve, how do we build a culture that actually can attract and retain the very best talent for the long term? How do we win for the long term? How would we do that? Well, the reality is this. The world we live in today, people are able to work anywhere. We're not confined by the geography of where we were born or even where we can work. And fundamentally, the ability to build a winning culture is, I believe, both the challenge and the opportunity that many of us have the opportunity to do. And I often say again, if it can be visual, it's much easier to remember. The first thing any organization has to do is it has to learn what it does and how it does it well. If you're making students, then do it brilliantly. If you're making Coca-Cola, then make it wonderfully. If you're making whatever it is in your business or your organization, learn how to deliver your operating model. That's very rarely the challenge that most organizations deal with. The real challenge is, for the new world, how do you build a leadership culture and a leadership model that everyone is able to buy into? How do you create a common vocabulary and language for leadership that actually is something that you can identify, you can codify? Codification, particularly if you can represent it in visual form, because the world is visual now more than oral, allows people to carry with them the DNA of the type of leadership that you want to multiply. Can it be modeled? The answer is, in the new world, it has to be. There's no good telling people further down the organization the type of leaders they should be if you're not actually living that example towards them. And lastly, it has to be reinforced. The way you reward, the way you promote. If you just reward people for being really good at running the operating model, but not living your leadership model, you in the end create a toxic culture and it won't work. So whatever it is you're leading, whether it's a nation, whether it's a company, whether it's a ministry, whether it's an organization or a family, the thing I would always challenge you to do is to be intentional about the type of leadership that you believe you want to codify, model, and then reinforce. Because if everyone in the organization, even everyone in a nation, starts to use a common vocabulary and language, you'll find that, as the anthropologists tell us, that language creates culture. Language is created by vocabulary or words that come to mean the same thing at the same time in the same place with the same people group. And we found then common vocabulary expressed in visual tools creates an objective language which allows language to be defined across companies the world over, and they begin to build a leadership model that everybody wants to work for. Everyone wants to be part of a winning culture, but a liberating culture is more than do we do our job well. A liberating culture is where we model, as the senior leaders, the type of life and the type of leadership that we want others to follow. So, creating a healthy culture, you have to be intentional. And I hope that's helpful for you. I'm sure there's so much more that could be said, but the idea being of saying you have to do the work yourself. You have to be healthy emotionally, physically, and intellectually, and you have to be intentional in how you do that, particularly those of us who are addicted to work and find it very, very hard to ever switch off and be present. You have to learn to lead through influence. You have to deal with your own self-preservation and the fears, particularly for those of us of a certain age, that the new world seems alien and threatening. It's not. It can be embraced, and actually the younger generation are crying out for role models and liberating leaders who will be Sherpas to them. And lastly, you have to codify your leadership model, and you have to reinforce it. You have to model it, because in the world we live in today, people are looking for are you living what you teach? Is there authenticity between what you say you are and what you actually do? I hope that was helpful, and I hope there's things in there you can take with you.
Thank you so much, Steve, for the great lecture. The science behind leadership in our era is becoming quite fascinating. With rapid development, ways it affects it, and surely it also affects the performance of the teams as well.
Yep.
I'm very interested in just to go deeper, and one of the elements that you've mentioned in your lecture, there was a core relation between the leader and the teams. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that communication is one of the key foundations that affects teams' performances?
Yes, there's a short answer, but I'll give you a longer one because I think you probably want that. We look at what makes a high-performing team. Google did a lot of research on this, which helped us, but they basically say there are 5 components that make a high-performance team. The first is communication, the second is relational trust, the third is clear alignment on objectives, the ability to execute, and a constant commitment to multiply capacity, because great teams usually get asked to do more. Communication is number 1, and there's a reason for that, is most leaders are too busy, and we're under pressure, and the easiest thing in the world is just to tell people what we're going to do and really just get compliance rather than full engagement. So communication is, I believe, the point at which you look round the room at your team and you ask the question is, does every person in this team feel truly heard, valued, and appreciated? Do I know the superpowers that they bring, the insights, the expertise, the wisdom, and am I prepared as the leader to create an environment where every person is able to share their best? Now, Google found 2 things in common with the highest performing teams, both of which are a deep challenge to me. One is the highest performing teams, each person spoke for roughly an equal amount of time in team meetings across a year. And the second was there was psychological safety, that the leader had created an environment where everyone, whatever their age, gender, ethnicity, experience, felt able to challenge any opinion put on the table, even if the person was the CEO of the company or the team leader. So if you think about it, communication learns how to harness the superpowers of each person in your team. When people feel that, relational trust grows. And when you have relational trust and healthy communication, we then are able to go to, how do we achieve the vision that we've set ourselves? How are we going to align? How are we going to actually deliver what we do? How are we going to execute on it? So communication for me is usually the missing piece, because it's always important, but it never seems urgent when leaders are up against deadlines. But it's the reason why the average team performs at 59% of its capacity, because in the end, what you're really dealing with is usually the wisdom of the leader and maybe the one person who's loud enough to challenge their opinion. When you start to harness the superpowers of all the people, that performance goes 80% plus. And we've done it with enough. Even Google had to admit that basically the metric worked. We said, if you have a healthy team that is scoring highly themselves on those 5 metrics, it will track every KPI you measure, from employee engagement, well-being, performance. And so in a sense, they validated the belief that communication is the foundation of every high-performing team.
I mean, I couldn't get a more shorter yet very elaborative answer to that question. Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you once again for the views and the lecture that we had today in our مجلس. استمعنا اليوم إلى الآراء التي شاركنا بها اليوم سيد ستيف، حيث أنه سلط الضوء على أهمية استمرار تفاعل القادة مع فرق العمل، ولكن بالأخذ بعين الاعتبار الصحة الجسدية والنفسية والذهنية، أو اختيار المستوى المناسب بين المستويات ال5 التي تطرق لها في عالم حيث العمل لا يتوقف أبداً، وأن القادة يمكنهم قيادة الفرق من خلال الإلهام، التواصل والتأثير الإيجابي، وبشكل أكثر تفاعلاً من استغلال المسمى الوظيفي أو الإدارة السطحية، وباستخدام أيضاً طرق مبتكرة مثل نظام التواصل أو كما أسماها السيد ستيف نظام الأصوات الخمس، وأن القيمة الكامنة وراء بناء ثقافة مؤسسية يمكنها في النهاية جذب أفضل المواهب والعقول واستدامتها مؤسسياً. أود أن أشكر السيد ستيف مجدداً على محاضرته القيمة والرد على السؤال، وأشكر أيضاً الحضور الكريم على حسن استماعهم. وفي الختام نجدد الشكر لسيدي صاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن زايد آل نهيان رئيس الدولة على استضافة هذه المحاضرات الهامة في مجلس سموه. وأما الآن يشرفني أن أدعو الفريق سمو الشيخ سيف بن زايد آل نهيان للصعود إلى المنصة مع المشاركة في الفيديو لأخذ صورة جماعية.